it's we've been told not to say anything except affiliations about the speakers, but I just want to say one thing about both speakers. Today we heard the suggestion, which may have aroused some controversy, that Aby Warburg really should be seen as an artist. Well, with the broad definition of artist that we have now, maybe that's all right. But I'm happy to say that our last two speakers are probably, with maybe one or two exceptions, I suddenly realize as I look around, but our first two speakers this afternoon are probably the greatest of the writers who will be appearing at this conference. Ulrich Raulff in German and Marina Warner in English. I mean, we're all reasonably good, but they are super. So I'm very happy to be able just to introduce my good friend Ulrich Raulff, good friend, co-conspirator, all kinds of things. And as you know, he has long been the head of the great Deutsches Literaturarchiv in Marburg and the editor of that very lively journal, aside from the many books, the Zeitschrift für Idee und Geschichte. We like Idee und Geschichte despite the advent of materialism. Ulrich, go ahead.
Thank you, David, and don't believe him a word. But let me nevertheless start by saying thank you, and my deep felt thanks to David Friedberg and Claudia Wiedepol for inviting me to this truly great conference. 6 years ago, in May 2010, the New York branch of the Goethe Institute opened an art exhibition entitled Nachleben. Obviously, Warburg's concept was on its way to a global linguistic career similar to kindergarten oder Wohlsterben. In the introductory note, the curators, Fionn Mead and Lucy Raven, mentioned Warburg's, quote, signature idea of Nachleben, meaning both afterlife and survival, thus offering two possible translations of a word we seem to be familiar with. Actually, Nachleben is a somewhat complicated affair. It is one of those Warburgian concepts that we use as if they were philosophical notions. But perhaps Cornelia Zumbusch was right when she called them Begriffshybride and described Warburg's notoriously dense prose as formelhafte Sätze, die naturwissenschaftliche Gesetze nachahmen, which means formula-like sentences imitating scientific laws. Many of Warburg's concepts may not be Begriffe at all, but metaphors, colorful, original, and sometimes enigmatic metaphors. In the next half hour, I would try to find out what Warburg meant when he spoke of the famous Nachleben der Antike, if he did so at all. That is, if the concept was not crafted by posteriority, as Martin Tremmel tends to think. I will dive into the origins and uses of the concept, discuss the structure of its semantics, and touch upon the romanticism behind the idea of an afterlife of cultures. Like the New York curators, almost all of Warburg's biographers and commentators are unanimous in assuring that Nachleben was his main concern. Ernst Gombrich thought so, and Gombrich's critic, Georges Didier-Übermann, agrees. Quote, Didier-Übermann, survival is the central concept, the Hauptproblem of Aby Warburg and the Warburgian school of art history, end quote. Behind perfect consensus lurks disagreement. By fiercely asserting that survival is the only possible translation for Nachleben, Didier-Übermann, who's, by the way, today spoke of afterlife, but in his book and in his writings 10 years ago, he preferred survival. Didier-Übermann marks his difference from Gombrich, Panofsky, and other representatives of the Warburg school. Throughout his 2003 essay and already in his 2002 book, Didier-Übermann keeps complaining about the suppression of the survivals cherished by Warburg and of a complex, non-evolutive and impure time by the custodians of the tradition. In other words, the question of either afterlife or survival, left open by the New York curators, is categorically decided by Didi Übermann in favor of survival. The opposite happens when David Friedberg, director of the Warburg Institute, talks about Warburg's main concern. David uses the word afterlife, and he reproaches the Warburgians after Gombrich for having uniquely cared about the after and forgotten about the life. In contrast to Warburg, whose interests comprised medicine, biology, and psychology. Uwe Fleckner, as you all have witnessed on his brilliant lecture on Warburg and Manet this morning, also used the word afterlife, thus securing a linguistic brotherhood in arms between the two Warburgian Spukhäuser. In his intellectual biography of Warburg, Ernst Gombrich made Bonn the cradle of Nachleben. In autumn 1886, when Warburg took up his studies, Bonn was under the spell of Henry Tode and Hermann Usner, two teachers and researchers deeply interested in recurrent phenomena of former periods in Renaissance art, Tode, and mythology, Usner. And even though he had left Bonn for Leipzig a dozen years earlier, Anton Springer's spirit was still alive in the art history department. Unlike the two others, Springer actually had used the word Nachleben. In 1862, he had published an article on Das Nachleben der Antike im Mittelalter, the afterlife or survival of antiquity in medieval ages, in which he demonstrated that antiquity had never ceased to exert a powerful influence on the creative mind. To illustrate this Nachleben, Springer used concepts like repetitions, imitations, replica, and revivals. He called antiquity a vital element in medieval artistic life and described the awakening of a longing for and the enthusiasm to revive antiquity since the second half of the 12th century. Thus, in Springer's terminology, antiquity was not just a bloodless influence, but a magical presence and an object of desire. Didi Übermann blames Springer's Nachleben for being a one-dimensional notion that simplified history by arranging it in periods. Thus, Springer, one of the first historians to reproach Hegel for slicing history sausage-like into periods, now has the same critique pinned on him. Warburg's Nachleben does better. Didi Übermann credits it with being a structural notion capable of disorienting and anachronizing history. Quote, "It leads to the paradoxon that oldest things may appear after less old ones." Didi Übermann has no doubt as to the origins of the concept. Warburg's Nachleben is originally an Anglo-Saxon notion. He finds evidence in Julius von Schlosser's essay on die Porträtbildnerei in Wachs of 1911, where the English word survivals appears once in an unspecified way in the introduction. The philological evidence being weak, Didi Übermann sticks all the more to the belief that both Warburg and Schlosser were dependent on the British ethnologue Edward B. Tylor. Tylor had used the word and had used the concept survival since 1865, meaning, quote, the standing over, superstitio, of old customs within a new and changed situation. One might tend to take these arguments for trite games of Begriffsgeschichte. The opposite is true. They are calculated moves. The aim is to take Warburg out of the traditional history of art, with its simplifying periodizations, and to put him into anthropology, with complicated, anachronistic temporalia. Warburg thus gets invested as witness against his school, and especially against Erwin Panofsky, Didi Übermann's Bête Noire. Martin Trennell's intentions are less ambitious. Still, he doubts Warburg's copyright for the famous concept. He hints at older literary instances, the Brother Grimm's vocabulary, mentioning Goethe and Gervinus, as well as Lessing and Jean-Paul, two of Warburg's favorite authors, both using Nachleben verbatim. Like Didier Übermann, Tremmel sees Warburg leaving the home of pure art history, and joining the camp of anthropology. He also, like Didier Übermann, mentions the English schools of Darwin, Tyler, and Fraser, to whom he adds three finds in Nietzsche. But it is not these literary forerunners that nourish Tremmel's doubts, but Warburg's own rare and floating use of the concept. Indeed, the difference is remarkable to the determined use of Nachleben by Bing, Saxel, and Wind once Warburg was dead. The final sign was set in 1934 by the Kulturwissenschaftliche Bibliographie zum Nachleben der Antike, introduced by Wind and meant to prove the existence of a school. Since the volume was published in Leipzig and later in London, it was given a second title, a bibliography on the survival of the classics. From now on, the notion of Nachleben, as well as its translation by survival, seemed canonical. In the spring of 2015, a German collector of autographs, a former senior civil servant, and addicted reader of Warburg bought a small book from an antiquarian bookseller in Munich. The provenance of the piece, an off-print bound in elegant cardboard, style early 20th century, is still unclear. Only one thing is sure. It must have once been a part of Warburg's library. The label clearly shows Warburg's handwriting. The signet of the KBW, the KBW, indicates 1911 as terminus a quo. But neither do I know when and how the Separatum entered Warburg's library, nor do I know when and how it left it. The good news is it still exists. So Warburg's hand on the label reads Münz, and below, Über Springer, Nachleben der Antike. The stamp on page 629 on the right corner, right upper corner. The stamp on that page says it's a première preuve, that is the first galley proof of October 13, 1887. The text itself is a compte rendu of Adolf Springer's Bilder aus der neueren Kunstgeschichte, that came out 1 year before, by the French art historian Eugène Münz. Actually, Münz discusses only one of the essays in Springer's collection, the first one, now 24 years old, on Das Nachleben der Antike im Mittelalter. As you see yourself, his translation reads, La tradition antique chez les artistes du Moyen Âge. Although the piece shows no further traces of Warburg's hand, it indicates his sustained interest in the discussion started by Springer and resumed by Münz. The latter, by the way, offers another, less pale translation of Nachleben when he writes on page 631, Monsieur Antoine Springer nous montre l'Antiquité se survivant en quelque sorte, tel est le sens du mot Nachleben, à travers le Moyen Âge. Se survivant en quelque sorte, antiquity surviving itself, an interesting variation among all ideas associated to Nachleben. But how about Warburg himself? Did he use the concept only sporadically and in an unsystematic way as Tremmel claims? Did Nachleben mean less to him than to his Nachwelt? Tremmel hints at the meeting of the future curatorium of the KBW on December 31, 1927. Taking the event as reason to sum up his endeavors, Warburg puts die Frage nach dem Einfluss der Antike, the question of the influence of antiquity, at the center of his Lebenswerk. The influence, mind you, not the Nachleben. Influence, as you may agree, is a rather unspecific notion, not just neutraler, more neutral, as Tremmel has it, but poorer in connotations. A notion swimming in metaphors of floating and streaming, influence, against a notion flavored with the imagery of Gothic novels, romantic Kaisersage, necromantics, and contemporary spiritism, afterlife. No doubt about Warburg's choice of term. Actually, the opposite happened. During all his life, Warburg's labeling of his Hauptproblem stayed floating and rich in variations. Take, for instance, the letter to his brother Felix of December 21, 1909. Aby writes, "You know that for 20, I give you a raw translation because I think there is no official translation so far. You know that for 20 years I've been occupied by the subject of the influence of antiquity on contemporary culture. What I have achieved so far is the proof, the evidence, of a direct and conscious resumption of antiquity, antique motives by the early Renaissance. What I did not hope to be able of showing is the continuous medieval life of antiquity. The results of my research trip to Rome last winter gave me what I needed." The writer starts with the influence of antiquity, continues with the resumption of antique motives, and ends up with the continuous medieval life of antiquity. In one sentence, he changes from a classical metaphor of streaming to an active reprise, and finally to a vital process. In his essays and lectures on the Florentine Renaissance, he mostly uses Einfluss der Antike, influence of antiquity, but sometimes opts for recoining, umprägen, of ancient motives, or revival of the classics, Wiederbelebung des klassischen Altertums. He notes that ancient reliefs of battle and victory have überlebt, have survived, on triumphal arches that have not been conserved. But then he deletes the überlebt, the survived, and replaces it by the weaker existiert haben, have existed. Martin Tremmel notes that Nachleben was used, quote, promiscuously with other concepts, end of quote, by the fin siècle, and this is what Warburg did too. In his famous Kifferneuer lecture, for instance, he acts as a fiery lover of variations. He alternates nachlebende, echt griechische Pathosformeln, Wiedergeburt, wiedererweckte Klassiker, echt antike Rekonstruktion, Wiederbelebung, and restitution of the Olymp, Restitution des Olymps. Tremmel seems to think that only with Warburg's Nachwelt, that is, with Bing, Saxel, and Wind, Nachleben der Antike became the trademark of the Warburg school. Warburg himself, thinks Tremmel, rarely used the famous notion, and if he did so, it was only on his file cards and in his correspondence, an assumption that does not stand up to closer examination. For an intermediate account, let us record the fact that Warburg disposes of an extensive mobile vocabulary, rich in variations, and perfectly suitable for the overall description of those processes of tradition by which the classics reached the modern world of European painting and drawing. Many of his favorite terms are closer to metaphors than to notions in the philosophical, technical sense. On the highest and most superficial level of his texts, everything is flowing and whirling like currents in a river, so that influence may indeed be a most fitting metaphor. But there is another level in Warburg's descriptions, a deeper or micro level. It is the level on which Warburg reconstructs Nachleben as an active process of negotiations, of intellectual and artistic theft, of assimilation and recoining. The author is busy describing the afterlife of antiquity no longer in a summary, but in an analytical way. Having left the zone where metaphors are whirling, we have reached the study or laboratorium, as Warburg would have it, where the metaphor is object to work. Take, for instance, the lecture on Eintritt des antikisierenden Idealstils in die Malerei der Frührenaissance, given by Warburg on April 20, 1914, at the Kunsthistorische Institute in Florence. The lecturer shows how pathetic motifs have left the ancient sarcophagi and triumphal arches and were drawn and transposed into the artistic language of the Quattrocento. This is no longer influence, no longer a diffuse, erratic flow. Warburg precisely describes processes of transmission of sculpture into painting, transpositions from three-dimensional into two-dimensional art, translation of archaeological material into contemporary imagery, transformation of pagan passion into Christian restraint, transport of tragic pathos into the business of bourgeois life. In other words, he describes artistic gestures that boldly transcend the borders of genre, media, and material, and compress 2 millenniums' work in the moderation of passion. He thus explains large-scale restructurings of semantic fields capable not just to transpose an ancient sculpture into different media and different milieux, like bourgeois interior, but to provide her with a radical new meaning. For instance, when he writes that we are free to disregard the archaeology of the Nympha Fiorentina as long as we understand the young woman to be a symbol of the joy of life as the Quattrocento felt it. So in order to understand what Warburg meant by Nachleben, counting the floating metaphors of influences and renaissances on the surface of his text will not do. Begriffsgeschichte is more than a citation index. One has to follow the trace of transpositions from one genre to the next, one medium and one milieu to the other, and study the analytical, technical, and psychological interpretations Warburg offers. Never mind the inconsistence and the promiscuous use of concepts on the macro level of Warburg's text. It is on the micro level that the semantic is produced. The true work of transposition is done in the workshop of description, analogous with the workshops of art. Antiquity, wrote Warburg, on the Florentine merchant Francesco Sassetti, in a passage blending history with autobiography, antiquity, I quote, was more to him than an affair of taste. It was the reawakened past of his home ground, belonging to him and affecting him like streaks of memory of half-forgotten days of his life. The reawakened past of his home ground. By using romantic clues like this, Warburg devotes his text to memoria, but also to the idea of resurrection. The semantics of Nachleben is consciously dyed with spooky and spectral traits. For only those who have been dead and buried can be subject to reawakenings. Lazarus, Christ, the resurrection of the dead. One of the sources of ancient pathos formula for the artists of the earlier Renaissance was, as Warburg used to demonstrate, the imagery of sarcophagi. Rembrandt still drew from this source, as Warburg showed in a 1926 lecture, only to transcend the, quote Warburg, öde sarkophagisch affektierte Gebärdensprache, the dull sarcophagic language of gestures. Quote goes on, without losing the poetical force of its mythical contents. Without losing the poetical force of its mythical contents, end of quote. Warburg himself proved some poetical force when he credited Rembrandt's Rape of Proserpina for transmitting, I quote, eben jene unheimliche Hadesluft, this spooky air of Hades, a sarcophagic heritage, ein sarkophagisches Erbteil, welche schon seit dem Erwachen die Plastik und Malerei der Frührenaissance durchzittert. Nachleben, as die Übermann justly remarked, is a temporal notion, a Temporalkategorie. It aims at the posterity of an epoch and its belated reappearance or its haunting presence in some other time. It supposes a juxtaposition or inflection of times, literally a complicatio in the sense of a folded or layered, multi-layered time. Warburg, who used to call himself a revenant after his years at the Kreuzlingen Sanatorium, had a remarkable sensitivity for the aura of uncanniness surrounding the idea of Nachleben or afterlife. In fact, the life after the life, la vie d'outre-tombe, indicates the return of something deceased or past into the presence. How exactly does this comeback take place? For Warburg, it is neither a mode of still being there or still being alive, nor is it an act of visitation. The dead do not return by themselves. They get resuscitated and are brought back to life by art and artists. Humanists may be capable of similar accomplishments, at least in Warburg's eyes. His picture of Sassetti, in which he made the voices of the archive speak, appeared to him as a resuscitation by the voices of the past. With regard to the Bilderatlas, he coined his famous word of Gespenstergeschichte für ganz Erwachsene, ghost stories for adults. Like his romantic predecessor, the French historian Jules Michelet, Warburg considered himself to be a necromant, comparable to the artist who brought a dead fragment of the past back to life, even though he changed its context, form, and meaning. The digger in the archive induced a resuscitation by the voices of the past. Of course, we should not overemphasize the uncanny Hadesluft and the sarcophagic heritage in Warburg's prose. But the question may be asked if the author, who did not recoil from using the metaphoric of grave and resuscitation, may not have been closer related to certain traditions of romantic archaeology and mythology of the 19th century than we used to think. I confess, I do not see any traces of Johann Jakob Bachhofen in Warburg's readings or writings. Unlike the two other famous Baselians, Jakob Burckhardt and Friedrich Nietzsche, Bachhofen was not among Warburg's paramount authors, and it is not difficult to see why. Bachhofen, as far as I know, never used the word Nachleben. But Die Sage von Tanaquil, his last work, was all about Nachleben, actually an afterlife that happened in antiquity itself. It was the Nachleben of an Oriental pre-Greek culture within the world of Rome and Italy. No other historian in the immediate pre-Warburg era was so deeply obsessed by the double phenomenon of survivals and the tectonic or sarcophagic afterlife. This brings me to my temporary conclusion. I readily agree with Georges Didi Übermann in Tout le Monde that Nachleben was Aby Warburg's Hauptproblem. But although he was a critical historian and gave, on what I call the micro level of his analysis, very fine and precise records of the different processes that brought the classics back to modern artistic life, he nevertheless cherished some romantic or sarcophagic ideas and metaphors. Maybe he used them in the same way as Rembrandt, that is, Warburg's Rembrandt, did, as a media to mythic realms and their poetic force. This again is a deeply romantic idea, but not alien to other founders of the discourses of anthropology in the 20th century. Just think of the motto Freud had set over the entrance of his Traumdeutung. So when I agree that Nachleben was Aby Warburg's main concern, I also agree with the curators of the New York exhibition. These young people had realized that while you must not split Warburg's signature idea, you have to split its translation, because Nachleben is both critical survivals and romantic afterlife. You can't have one without the other. And who would want to? Thank you.